Beneath the dim light of a bare bulb, imagine a house where silence no longer means safety. In this house, a brother waits for his sister, not as family, not as blood, but as judge, jury, and executioner. The story that unfolds here is not written in the usual pages of history because it was never meant to be told. It is a story whispered only in fragments, in the kind of small-town records most people never read, where cruelty disguises itself as discipline and shame becomes a weapon sharper than any blade. What happened to her began with something so ordinary, so modern, that it could have happened to almost anyone. The leaking of private videos, images never meant to leave the secrecy of her own choosing. But once those digital fragments escaped, they weren't just data anymore. They became her chains, and her brother was the one who held them tight. Think about it. The people closest to us, the ones we grow up with, are supposed to protect us when the world turns vicious. But in this family, blood was not a bond. It was a curse. He saw in her humiliation not a sister to shield, but an opportunity to dominate. He didn't see the girl he once shared a childhood with. He saw dishonor, a stain upon their name, and in his twisted mind, punishment was the only cure. And punishment, for him, meant torture. The walls of that house became an echo chamber of screams that no neighbor heard, or perhaps chose not to hear. Behind closed doors, pain became ritual. He stripped her of dignity, of freedom, of identity, piece by piece. Not just physical torment, but psychological chains that sank deeper with each passing day. He wanted her silence, but more than that, he wanted her obedience. What does it say about a place, about a family, when cruelty is not hidden from those closest to it, but excused? Some knew, some always know. The cruelest part of these stories is not just the act itself, it's the silence that surrounds it. That suffocating silence, heavier than any scream, that tells the victim, no one is coming, no one will help you. This is the story of a brother and a sister, but it's also a story of America's hidden houses, where blood ties do not save but betray. The first cuts weren't made with knives, they were made with words. He told her she had ruined everything, that she was filth, that she was the reason people whispered when their family name was spoken. He replayed her humiliation again and again, not just in his mind, but in hers. Every time she closed her eyes, he reminded her of the videos, of how they traveled through phones and screens like wildfire. For him, this wasn't just about control, it was about rewriting who she was. He wanted her to believe she was nothing more than a shameful spectacle, a stain he needed to scrub away with suffering. But words alone weren't enough for him. He devised punishments that blurred the line between discipline and sadism. Some nights, he locked her in the basement, forcing her to sit in darkness for hours, sometimes days, until even time stopped making sense. Other times he would play music loudly above her head, so every note felt like a hammer breaking her thoughts apart. He didn't just want her silence. He wanted her to lose her grip on herself, to crumble so completely that she would become nothing but the shadow he controlled. And while the torture was hidden, the family's silence was louder than any scream she ever gave. The mother claimed not to notice. The father worked late shifts and never asked questions, and yet everyone in that house knew. Silence becomes its own form of violence. It teaches the abuser that he is untouchable, and it teaches the victim that her suffering doesn't matter enough to stop. Some nights, she begged him to end it, to just finish what he had started. But he never did, because ending her wasn't the point. The point was to stretch out her pain, to make her existence itself a punishment. To him, each day she breathed was another opportunity to remind her that she belonged beneath him, broken, voiceless, and marked forever by the shame he carried. Read like a torch. And yet, something strange happens when torment lasts too long. The mind begins to fracture, yes, but sometimes in those fractures a spark of resistance is born. She started to dream in secret of ways out. She counted cracks in the walls, traced the patterns of light that slipped through the floorboards above, small details that reminded her that there was still a world outside the prison her brother built. She began to measure time, not by clocks, but by footsteps. His boots on the floorboards overhead, the pauses in his breathing, the sound of keys rattling when he locked the basement door. Each sound became a calendar, each silence a page turned in a book of torment. She learned that the human mind, even when crushed beneath cruelty, searches desperately for patterns, for meaning. It was all she had left, and it kept her alive. But he grew bolder. What started as confinement and words soon escalated into something far darker. He used the very images that had destroyed her reputation as a weapon against her. He would force her to watch them, to relive her own violation as though it was a ritual. Every frame was another lash, every replay another scar etched not on her skin, but on her soul. For him, it wasn't enough to control her body. He wanted to erase her identity, to burn away any trace of who she had once been. The neighbors sometimes wondered why the windows of that house were always closed, why the sister seemed to vanish for days at a time. But in towns like theirs, people learned long ago that curiosity is dangerous. Nobody asked questions they didn't want answered. And so, she suffered in plain sight, her absence explained away by excuses that everyone accepted because it was easier than facing the truth. That is how abuse thrives, in shadows cast by willful blindness. And yet, as the days blurred into months, a shift began inside her. Suffering does strange things to the human spirit. Some collapse beneath it. Others, against all odds, begin to build a secret strength. For every word he spit at her, she created a small chamber of silence within her mind, where his voice couldn't reach. For every lock he turned, she imagined doors of her own making, doors that one day she might walk through. He thought he was destroying her, but in those small, hidden places, she was learning how to endure and even how to plan. Because the longer he tormented her, the more he revealed about himself, his patterns, his weaknesses, his fears. And in those moments of cruel routine, she began to understand a terrible truth. Survival wasn't just possible, it might also mean revenge. The revenge did not come quickly. It grew slowly, like a seed watered with her own tears. She began to notice that cruelty made him careless. He believed in his own power so completely that he stopped hiding his routines. He drank more. He slept heavier. He left the keys too close, the doors slightly ajar. He believed she was broken beyond repair, a puppet whose strings he alone controlled. But what he could not see was that the cracks he carved into her spirit had also let something else in, a cold clarity, a determination born from despair. At first, her rebellion was small, invisible. She stopped crying when he demanded it. She refused to give him the satisfaction of watching her break. Instead, she stared back at him with hollow eyes, silent but unyielding. That silence rattled him in ways her screams never had. It told him that somewhere, in a place he could not reach, she was still alive. And that terrified him. But he did not stop. Instead, he escalated, as abusers always do. He tightened his grip, forced her to kneel for hours, deprived her of food, burned her skin with cigarettes when she disobeyed. To him, each act was a lesson, each scar a signature. But the more he tried to crush her, the more she grew certain that she had only two choices left: to die in that house, forgotten, or to find a way to make sure her story did not end in silence. The family, by then, had become little more than ghosts. The mother's eyes looked away. The father buried himself in work. Brothers, cousins, neighbors, they all chose ignorance over interference. The house itself became a coffin, not just for her, but for every witness who chose to pretend nothing was happening inside. This is how families rot, not from a single act of cruelty, but from the silence that allows cruelty to thrive. And so she began to wait. Every sound, every mistake he made became part of her map. She knew his footsteps as well as her own heartbeat. She knew which nights he drank himself unconscious, which hours he left the keys dangling from his pocket. She knew the sound of opportunity, and she learned to wait for it like a predator hiding in the grass. Because when survival is no longer enough, the only thing left to hunger for is freedom and vengeance. The night she chose was like any other, and that was the brilliance of it. He had been drinking. The air was thick with the smell of stale liquor and sweat, and the house seemed to sink deeper into silence than usual. She sat in the dark, listening to the rhythm of his movements, the stagger of his steps, the metallic jingle of the keys that slipped carelessly from his belt to the counter. He didn't notice. He never thought he needed to. In his mind, she was too broken to reach for freedom, but broken things can cut deepest when you least expect it. When his breathing slowed into the heavy rasp of drunken sleep, she moved. Not quickly, she couldn't risk it. Every step had to be silent, every breath measured. She took the keys with hands that trembled not from fear anymore, but from something sharper, anticipation. The basement door opened with a groan she thought would wake the entire world, but he did not stir. She stood at the threshold of the house that had been her prison, and for the first time in months, maybe years, she remembered what it felt like to choose her own movement. But she didn't run. Not yet. She walked back into the living room where he lay sprawled on the couch, unconscious, a monster reduced to something almost pathetic. She looked at him for a long time. Every scar he had given her, every humiliation he had carved into her soul, stood between them like an army of ghosts. She could have left. She could have vanished into the night, but escape wasn't enough anymore. She picked up the empty bottle he had dropped to the floor. Glass glinted faintly in the low light. For a moment she hesitated, not out of mercy, but out of the weight of what it meant to strike back. He had taken so much from her, reshaped her into something she never asked to be, and yet, standing over him, she realized he had also given her this one thing, the clarity to know that she would never be free as long as he breathed. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you run? Or would you make sure the cycle ended right there in the shadows of that house? The first strike shattered not just glass, but years of silence. The bottle broke across his face with a sickening crack, and in the sudden eruption of pain he woke, eyes wild, blood streaming. But he was sluggish, drunk, slow to rise. She was not. Every ounce of torment he had poured into her came rushing back in those seconds, not as weakness, but as fuel. She struck again, and again, until the man who had been her brother was reduced to nothing more than a gasping, bleeding heap. He tried to speak, to command her like he always had, but words no longer had power over her. His voice, once a weapon, now sounded pathetic, stripped of authority. In those moments, she saw him not as a monster, but as something even more tragic, a boy who had mistaken cruelty for control, who thought breaking his sister would somehow fix the emptiness inside himself. But she didn't pity him. Pity was a luxury she had long since buried. When he finally slumped back, half-conscious and broken, she stood over him with the glass still cutting into her palm. She could end it then, a twist of glass, a deeper wound, and her suffering would be avenged. Yet freedom isn't always found in blood. Sometimes it's found in choice, and for the first time in her life, she had one. She could kill him, or she could walk away, carrying not just her survival, but his eternal fear of what she had become. She dropped the glass. The sound rang out like a final verdict. Then she walked out of that house barefoot, her steps steady, leaving behind the brother who had once ruled her existence. Outside, the night air hit her lungs like fire, raw and new. The world was vast again, endless in possibility, and though she carried scars that would never fade, she carried something else too, proof that even in the darkest prisons, the human spirit can claw its way to the surface. The house stood silent behind her, A2, and B for the family that chose to stay quiet. And though he lived, he would never again be the same. She had taken back something he could never touch, her will. That night the curse of silence was broken. She disappeared into the night, and with her absence, the story of that house began to unravel. At first, the family tried to hide it, weaving lies about where she had gone, claiming she had run off with strangers, that she was unstable, that she had brought shame upon them and fled. But silence is fragile. It cracks when pressed too hard, and soon neighbors whispered of blood on the walls, of screams they had ignored, of a brother who never quite looked anyone in the eyes again. The truth never appeared in newspapers. No reporter came to pry open the doors of that house. Instead, it lived in rumors, half-spoken confessions exchanged in hushed tones at grocery stores and gas stations. People said they had always known something was wrong there. They said they had heard things, seen things, but didn't want to get involved. In their excuses lay the real horror, not just the cruelty of one man, but the quiet complicity of an entire community. As for her, she became a ghost. Some claimed she left town and built a new life under a new name. Others believed she wandered deeper into the country, disappearing into the cracks of America, where no one asks questions. No matter where she went, one truth clung to her like a shadow. She had faced her tormentor and walked away alive. That kind of survival carves itself into the soul, both a wound and a weapon. And what of the brother? He bore his scars like a mirror of his sins. The gashes on his face never healed right. The broken bone beneath his eye socket made his gaze forever crooked. When he walked through town, people looked away, not out of sympathy, but out of fear. They didn't know what had truly happened that night, but they knew enough. His power had been stripped from him. In its place was only shame. This is where the story settles, in the uneasy space between history and myth. A sister tortured until she found strength in her suffering. A brother who believed cruelty made him powerful, only to discover it left him powerless. A family and a town that chose silence, and in doing so, became part of the crime. These stories are not rare. They live in forgotten houses, buried beneath American soil, waiting for someone to dig them up. And now, you've heard one of them. The question is, what will you do with it? Will you turn away like the neighbors did? Or will you remember that in every shadowed house, silence is the most dangerous weapon of all?